students, it is time to review for your next exam. This time, let's start off with the Enlightenment. Now, to understand the Enlightenment, you really have to understand the movement that came before it, namely the Scientific Revolution, because you can see how one influenced the other. The Scientific Revolution is a period where scientists start questioning and challenging traditional teachings. Instead of just accepting what had been written by the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans or what's written in the Bible, people start using reason. People start using experiments. They start using the power of observation to draw new conclusions, right? To challenge what had come before. Similarly, 100 years later, we're going to see with the Enlightenment, same thing. People start using reason. People start questioning traditional authority. But now their focus is on government and society. So again, in the scientific revolution, that was that period where you had Copernicus and Galileo questioning, the universe, the solar system, as far as, does the sun circle the earth or does the earth in fact circle the sun, right? And then you also had Newton. He's the one who invented calculus and, all these great scientific achievements. Similarly, in the Enlightenment, you have these great thinkers who come forward with new models for how government should function. And what really comes under fire during the Enlightenment is divine right of kings. Before the Enlightenment, the model of government in most societies was that a monarch gets his or her authority from God, from the divine right of kings. And this assumption, this traditional way of thinking, is called into question. And now we start to see Europeans start to question. They start to change their thinking about what government is, what role it should have in society. Now, this, again, it may sound, this idea of kind of questioning and kind of limiting government's power, that what's going to come out of the Enlightenment, again, it doesn't come out of nowhere. This should sound familiar because we talked about this in Britain. In Britain, remember, it had this history of limiting the king's power. You may remember they signed the Magna Carta in 1215, which limited King John's power. It wasn't that binding because, again, later kings assert divine right, and, that's how you had the English Civil War. But then with William and Mary signing the English Bill of Rights, this limiting of the monarch's power becomes law. So the English Bill of Rights, after the English Bill of Rights, you see in Britain, instead of having an absolute monarch that's all powerful, you start to see a limited monarch. So this idea of limiting government's power during the Enlightenment, it's going to spread. It's going to spread to Europe, and then from Europe, it's going to spread to the Americas. All right? So who are these Enlightenment thinkers? You should remember John Locke. He's the one who believed in natural rights. What are your natural rights? Life, liberty, property. And a government's duty? A government exists to protect those natural rights, and if it doesn't get the job done, get rid of it. Okay? You have the power to rebel. You should rebel. Montesquieu, he said, okay, a government that any kind of leader has too much power, that's dangerous. So therefore, you need to separate the powers. That's why, for example, in America, we don't have, an all-powerful president. We don't have one leader who has all the power. We split that power among three branches of government: the Congress, the Congress, which is the legislative branch, the president, which is the executive branch, and then the Supreme Court, which is the head of the judicial branch. And then lastly, Voltaire. Voltaire believed he promoted separation of church and state. He promoted freedom of speech, that's what you needed in a society. And again, there was also Rousseau and Wollstonecraft, but those are the three main people that come up, and specifically John Locke and Montesquieu, as far as people who are giving this new idea, this new vision of what government should be. All right, so these Enlightenment ideas are very, very powerful. And what we see is that they kind of set off revolutions, first in France, and then later those ideas, well, actually first in America, then in France, then back to America again. Okay, so as I said, we start off with the American colonists. They're the first ones to apply these Enlightenment ideas, and the colonists rebel from Britain, and then they gain their independence. Next is we see this in France, right? This is where the third estate it has a very paying too many taxes, um, and the ball starts getting rolling there with the French Revolution. Finally, next we have the revolutions now spread these Enlightenment ideas, the influence of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, those inspire the Latin American revolutions. And the Latin American revolutions include a revolution in Haiti and then in South America as well, and then also Mexico. All right, so let's first focus on the French Revolution. French Revolution, again, before the French Revolution, you have a king, an absolute monarch, King Louis XVI, and he rules according to divine right. And society is divided into three estates. Remember, one, two, three on the bottom, right? And the problem with being in the third estate, by the way, these, of course, naturally, these estates, how do you end up in your state? It's by birth. You have no choice. It doesn't matter how well educated you are. It doesn't matter your ability or what we call merit. It doesn't matter what you accomplish in your lifetime. It doesn't matter. You're stuck in your in your in your estate. The same way, if you remember in India, right, where they had the caste system under Buddhism, you're born into a caste, you die in the caste, you can't move. Same thing with the estate system in France, and it affects everything. It affects who you can marry. It affects what kind of job you'll get. It affects how much of a voice you have in government. It affects everything, and it's determined by birth. So you're stuck. Um, and so we looked at before the revolution, as I said, they have societies divided into these three estates. The only voice that people have in government is through the estates general. And the estates general follows this kind of model where really the only people who have a voice in the estates general is the estate one and two, even though 97% of the population is in the third estate. And again, because of this, because they have no power in government, because these are all powerless people stuck in this third estate, they end up being the ones who pay all the taxes. So if you see the graphic on the right, this third estate, the guy in the third estate is kind of carrying the weight of all the other parts of the government. That the third estate is basically paying the bills and having to, pay all this money in taxes in support of the other two estates. All right, so then we started the French Revolution, just really quick, the quick highlights. It starts with, people are very upset. They're very, very poor. There was a lot of starvation. So the king, knowing all this is going on, sets up a meeting for the Estates General. And lo and behold, what happens? Supposedly the third estate is locked out or for whatever reason doesn't go into the Estates General. And instead they meet on the tennis court and they take an oath. We are going to continue meeting until we come up with a new form of government. And this is that, and you start seeing where this idea catches on. You start seeing the people of France, they're going to storm the Bastille. Again, to protect the revolution from the French troops. They're going to need weapons, they're going to need bullets. So that's where you get the storming of the Bastille. That same year, I think it's like a month later, they write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. That, again, is filled with Enlightenment ideas, filled with this idea that the people should have, that they should have a limited government, that all citizens should have a voice in government, that they should get rid of feudal privilege, that there should be freedom of speech and freedom of the press and things like that. And those Enlightenment ideas are in that document. And as the revolution continues, you remember the king was taken prisoner and then tries to escape. And then he ends up being beheaded. The king and the queen will be beheaded. They will lose their life. And now suddenly, instead of a limited monarchy, now you have a republic. And it's during this era where basically the revolution goes to crazy town and you have the reign of terror. And this is where Robespierre, the Committee of Public Safety, the National Convention, they are looking to protect the revolution from its enemies. And they are going to find these enemies and they are going to strike terror in the hearts of the enemies of the revolution. And how do they do that? By cutting off a lot of people's heads using the guillotine. So again, that was a very, you go through the reign of terror, and then the National Convention is finally, the reign of terror ends when Robespierre gets his head chopped off, and then you have the Directory for a couple of years. But really, things in France are kind of until Napoleon takes over. Napoleon is the one, he has the coup d'etat, he overthrows the government, and he becomes the leader of France. And he becomes an absolute ruler. Basically, I mean, he starts, being elected by the people, and they elect him, first council for life, and then he names himself emperor. So he gains complete control of the country, but he does put a lot of these Enlightenment ideas into law. Things like getting rid of, feudal privilege, and allowing for freedom of religion, things like that. But really, the most important thing is that he restores political stability. France had been a mess. Things had been crazy for a while. And now you have a strong leader who unites France. He uses nationalism, which, of course, we're going to go into detail later. He unites the people, makes them strong. He ends up conquering most of Europe until, of course, Napoleon will lose his power when he invades Russia. You may remember he invaded Russia. He made it all the way to Moscow with his troops. But unfortunately, by the time he makes it back, he's dealing with the Russian winter. He's not able to get more supplies for his men. And he went in with 600,000 troops. He comes back with about 100,000 troops. So he loses 500,000 of his soldiers by invading Russia. And you may remember, basically that's the beginning of the end. And he will be overthrown, and then that's where you get the Congress of Vienna trying to reset the clock and try to restore Europe to how it was before the French Revolution and before Napoleon. All right, so now that we did that quick review of the French revolutions, now it's time to look at the Latin American revolutions. So the first one we took a look at was the Haitian Revolution. We went into great detail in the lessons, but for purposes of this exam, and to be perfectly frank, for purposes of most of the time, if you ended up taking the regions, they usually don't go, unfortunately, they don't go into too much detail. But the main thing you need to know is the name Toussaint Louverture. Very heroic figure. Remember, he was a former slave. He is the man who's able to unite the slaves and create an army that can fight France. And so it's under Toussaint Louverture that Haiti starts gaining some independence from France. Really, the true independence doesn't come until Toussaint Louverture is jailed and then imprisoned and then dies, and his second in command, Dessalines, takes over. But for purposes of the Regents, they always ignore Dessalines. They really focus on Toussaint Louverture. All right, so make sure you know that name, Toussaint Louverture, Haitian Revolution. And that's the one where the slaves unite to gain independence from France. All right, and then the other Latin American revolution we looked at was, of course, through South America. And this is the revolution led primarily by Simón Bolívar, but also José de San Martín is the other really notable person, but usually Simón Bolívar gets the most focus and attention. Again, this is the revolutions against Spain. They are going to gain independence from Spain. And this is where the Creoles, you may remember with the encomienda system, this is where the Creoles overthrow Spain and they gain independence for the Spanish colonies. After that, we took a quick look at Mexico. Again, Mexico it can be a little confusing because, I basically stuck it together just to make things simpler for us. So the idea is that step one in the 1800s is gaining independence from Spain. Remember that was the whole priest and, that whole movement. But unfortunately, once they gain independence from Spain, really the power just shifts to landowners in the church. So the average person, the natives, the African Americans, the poor people, they really don't gain that much. They really don't gain that much. Power is really held by basically the Creoles, the upper classes. Again, like I said, the landowners and the church. And after they gain independence, there's like a whole run of dictators, including Porfirio Diaz. So if you ever hear of that name, he's one of the big Mexican, very famous Mexican dictator, controlled the country for a very long time. But then in the 1900s, that's really where you start seeing more equality in Mexico. That's where you get the Mexican Revolution. That's the rise of leaders like Francisco Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, and they are the ones who make society much more equal. They're the ones who are able to overthrow the power of the church and of the landowners and gain more equality in society. So this is where you're going to see the Mexican Constitution. This is where you're going to see land reform, things like that. All right, so the final topic you need to know for the exam is nationalism. Now remember, the definition of nationalism: love for your nation. What do I mean by nation? That's your people. You can think of it as your country too, if that makes it easier. But basically, that love for your people, love for your nation. And when you feel that love, you want self rule. Okay? You want self determination. Okay? You want to make your own choice. You want a government run by your own people. You do not want an outsider giving you orders. Now, the interesting thing about nationalism, it does two opposite things at the same time. It brings people together and yet divides them at the same time. So what happens is people who are part of the same nation, right, who share traditions, who share a language, who share a culture, that unites them. Nationalism unites them. But at the same time they're united, it divides them from people who are not part of their nation. So what ends up happening is it can easily divide a society. The society is made up of more than one type of people. It can divide up a society. It can lead to terrorism, where people want independence from the leader. They feel nationalism. They want self-rule. They'll engage in terror. They'll engage in warfare. They'll try to split from their empire or whatever their government is to try to break off and gain independence. So again, nationalism causes people to come together, and at the same time, it causes different countries and different empires and things to fall apart. All right, so when we looked at nationalism, the first thing we took a look at is Italy. Now, this is an example of where we see nationalism bringing people together. And when you think of Italian nationalism, the main thing you want to focus on are your big key three players, right? Mazzini, Cavour, Garibaldi, right? Remember that? Mazzini was the one, the two Z's. He's the nationalism guy, the love for this idea. He's the one with Young Italy. Cavour, he was the brains of the operation. He was the one who was the prime minister, who came up with the strategy. And Garibaldi, he was the sword of the revolution. He was the one who fought and gained independence for that part of Italy, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. That's at the south end of Italy, the kind of foot part of the boot in the island there. He gained independence from Spain. He fought Spain and gained independence there. And as a result, Italy becomes a united country, and it is led by King Victor Emmanuel. Another country that's going to come together thanks to nationalism is Germany. And of course, if you're thinking about Germany, you must think of Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck. And if you don't remember that, it's going to break my heart. Anyway, Otto von Bismarck will unite Germany through blood and iron. Blood and iron. What do I mean by that? He is going to unite them. He's going to go to war 3 times. Once it's going to be there, Prussia will take part in the war between Austria and Denmark. Then Prussia will go to war with Austria. Then Prussia will go to war with France. And lo and behold, what's going to happen? Finally, after that, the Germanic people will be united. And they will be united under Kaiser Wilhelm I. Kaiser Wilhelm I was Otto von Bismarck's boss. Otto von Bismarck was prime minister to Kaiser. So they will be, this united Germany will become a country under Otto von Bismarck's king, Kaiser Wilhelm I. All right, and then finally, like I said, as much as nationalism can bring people together, it can also rip them apart. So, if you remember in class, we took a look at its effect on Austria, that Austria became this like split monarchy. Instead of being Austrian Empire, it became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then we looked at the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire also is going to start falling apart because all these different nations inside these empires are going to want self-rule. Now, the most impactful, the biggest thing that you really have to remember is the impact the impact of nationalism on the Ottoman Empire, specifically the impact that it has in the Balkans. Now, you may remember the Balkans is that area. It's kind of Eastern Europe. It's right above Greece. This area of the Balkans, there was a huge rise in nationalism, and there was real concern. People referred to it as the powder keg of Europe. You always have to know the powder keg of Europe, that it was just a matter of time before this area just explodes into warfare. And in fact, the fact that people refer to it as the powder keg of Europe, they were right, because this area, this Balkan peninsula, is going to be basically, that's going to start nationalism in this area is going to start World War I. So the powder keg of Europe, the Balkan Peninsula, is the nationalism there is a cause of World War I. All right, so that's it. If you know everything that I went over, you are going to do awesome on the exam. Good luck. I hope you all enjoy your vacation. I hope you come back ready to kick butt on the test. Bye, guys.